There can be situations where it's really useful to know which are the riskiest documents in a group of documents. Or is this particular contract that we're being asked to sign risky or not? Like, what level of review does it need? And so there's a set of features that come in called contract risk scoring. So what risk scoring does is it assigns a grade to documents, or more likely provisions within documents, and kind of groups all those scores for the different provisions together up into one document level grade to tell a user whether or not this document that they're looking at tends to be risky. So, for example, there's some clauses that can be highly risky. Like for me, as someone running a business, like I find anything around a restrictive covenant, like an exclusivity clause or a non-compete, especially non-solicit, less so, most favored customer, most favored nation pricing, sort of less so, but still can be really critical. Like those things can be really risky. Similarly, things around liability, like what the limitation of liability in a contract is, or the indemnification terms, can be really risky. For some companies, it might even be what the governing law is, right? Like, is it the governing law of a place that you understand, like New York or Ontario or the UK? Or is it some jurisdiction that you're not that familiar with and maybe you're even kind of worried about? Like, is that something you're comfortable with? And any of those could be a risk flag. What risk scoring does is it assigns a risk to those clauses, those elements of contracts, or to the contract itself. And that score enables users to kind of prioritize review. For a company, it can help them say, like, if they have a whole portfolio of contracts and they haven't been that careful with signing them up the whole way through, or they acquired in a portfolio of contracts, it can help them understand where they need to focus for remediation. If you're buying another company, it could be helpful in terms of helping you prioritize your review. Also, it can be really helpful pre-signature in determining like what level of review is needed for this contract. Like if it's a low-risk contract, maybe, so if it's like a no-risk or almost no-risk contract, maybe you can let people sign it without legal review. If it's a medium-risk contract, maybe it requires outsourced legal review. And if it's a high-risk contract, like it has something like an exclusivity clause in it, maybe you require like a very high level of review even within a legal department. And so risk scoring can help drive that. Problem with risk scoring is, well, a few problems with risk scoring. One is that risk is going to be different for every company. Like I personally really get very uncomfortable around exclusivity clauses. I think most people would. But there might be other companies where they're okay with things that I'm not, and vice versa. Like I definitely think there have been situations where we have not signed contracts that others might have done so, and that must be because we took the risk differently than they did. Another problem with risk scoring that makes it really tricky is that you can't necessarily tell from a software side who the clause runs against. Like if it's not a mutual exclusivity clause, if it's just exclusivity that binds one of the parties, then that means it's like very high risk for the party that has to be exclusive. And it's not necessarily high risk at all. Like there's no risk associated with the exclusivity for the party that has the benefit of the exclusivity clause. A third problem with risk scoring is sometimes like some of the highest risk things in a contract can not be visible within the clause itself, right? Like your counterparty is sketchy, for example, or it's of a risky type. Like if you're a company going around that's not HIPAA compliant, you're signing up business associate agreements, like that's super risky, but it's not something that like a contract analysis AI is going to tell you. Anyways, with all those caveats, contract risk scoring can still be really useful, and it doesn't necessarily even have to be that hard to create. One of our teammates, as just a demo at one point, took our outputs, I think assigned scores, like if there was an exclusivity clause, it was 5 points, and if the governing law was anything but one of a few jurisdictions, it was 1 point. And you'd say that any contract that got 0 points was not risky. Any contract that got less than 4 points was somewhat risky, and any contract that had 4 or more points was highly risky. And he was able to do that just using Doc AI and coming up with stuff, but certainly there are more extensive things that you can do with risk scoring. Anyways, useful feature, kind of tricky, probably going to be built by an end user who has a sense of what's risky in this particular space for their customer.